Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Annie. Thank you so much for joining us this week on Cooped Up with Carmen. Just to let you know, the Q&A function is available on the bottom of your screen, so please feel free to ask questions as they come up, and we will try to answer them during the webinar. If not, we will definitely reach out to you individually and get your questions answered. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce to you San Francisco's assessor, Ms. Carmen Chu.
Hi, everybody. I'm Carmen Chu, San Francisco's assessor. It's really great to see everybody, at least remotely here. Welcome to my home and welcome to Cooped Up with Carmen. As many of you may know who've tuned in before, the reason why we created this series was really to try to make sure that we get credible and useful information directly out to our residents and to people who are at home and curious about different issues. We fielded so many questions, whether it's about personal finances or businesses going through tough times recently. And so we wanted to really bring on to our Cooped Up with Carmen series experts who can really help to explain and talk through really practical tips for people to be able to help guide you in the next several weeks and months to come. Today, I'm really excited to bring on board Tobias. I always say this wrong. I say Tobias, but it's Tobias. Tobias, who is going to be joining us. Tobias Damm-Luhr, I should say. I'm going to read his bio. So here he goes. Tobias is a staff attorney with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights. It's a nonprofit organization that serves San Francisco, has been serving for San Francisco's clients for 52 years now. He's responsible for providing legal services to low-income and other small businesses. And in addition to overseeing small business legal clinics and workshops, he also helps to really build partnerships with pro bono attorneys and community partners, serving many of our minority-owned and low-income small businesses throughout the city. The project that involves is called Legal Services for Entrepreneur. And so we're really excited to bring Tobias here today because he's got a lot of really practical and good information for many of our small businesses who are truly struggling. Though we covered a little bit of the PPP issues and ways to connect with banks on our newsletter, today Tobias's focus is going to be a little bit more around the commercial rent component and about leases and how it is that people might be thinking about some of those challenges. And so I think I'm going to kick it right off and ask Tobias, again, we've gotten a lot of questions from a lot of our small businesses, and I think one of the things that's top of mind for folks is that they don't have either their businesses are closed or they're having really significantly reduced operations. And that's really impacting people's ability to keep things afloat in their businesses. And so I think a lot of people are thinking about all the fixed costs that they may have. So not only kind of utilities, but also rents and so on that are really things that you can't just say, I'm not going to pay, or I don't have the ability to kind of scale back on those things. And so I just wanted to provide a resource for folks and wanted to ask you, when it comes to commercial leases, we might want to just start off with the basics of commercial leases. And so it's the foundation for this contractual relationship between the property owner and the small business. And so, Tobias, is there some things that you suggest people to look out for in their leases that might be able to help them during this time?
Sure. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for having me, Assessor Chu. It's really great to be with you on this webcast. And Annie, if you could pull up the slides, that would be great. So first of all, before I answer your question, Assessor Chu, I just wanted to give a quick disclaimer that, since we're attorneys, we always have to give this disclaimer at the beginning of any workshop that, we're just providing this information as information only, and we can't make any guarantees about whether you can rely on it, although we've made our best efforts to put it together. And my organization, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, isn't becoming your lawyer by providing this information. And with that said, in answer to your question, Assessor Chu, about important commercial lease terms, there are several important commercial lease terms to pay attention to, which are listed on the slide. But I just want to say that each lease is different. So, lease terms vary very widely. So it's important to read your lease just to see how the terms are worded, because they could be different from
Right.
anyone else's lease. Some potentially important lease terms that would be relevant during the COVID-19 situation include default and remedies, like what happens if either party fails to meet an obligation. Any clause that allows the tenant to terminate the lease early, or the landlord to terminate the lease early for that matter. Clauses about the security deposit,
Right.
and clauses about force majeure, which is a legal term referring to events that are unexpected and that are beyond the party's control. And if you need help understanding your lease, you can talk to an attorney via the resources that we're going to talk about at the end of the webinar.
Tobias, you mentioned, and I see this on your slide here, there's a portion that talks a little bit about the security deposit. And so that sometimes could be potentially a source for people. Can you speak about that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's really, so the typical commercial lease allows landlords to apply any unpaid payment that's required under the lease towards the security deposit. Like, so it allows them to take a portion of the security deposit and apply it towards the unpaid payment that the tenant has not made. Actually, you know, I'll get into this a little bit later when we talk about San Francisco's commercial eviction moratorium. But you know, the Office of Economic and Workforce Development of the city issued guidelines on that moratorium, and those guidelines specifically discourage landlords from using the security deposit to make up for tenant missed in terms of their rent payment. Although, you know, if in your specific situation, if you're a tenant out there, you may be fine with the landlord doing that, depending on your financial situation. But, you know, for anyone who's a landlord out there, you know, you may be able to do that under your lease with the tenant, but the city is discouraging you from doing it.
I can see already that there's a lot of wrinkles associated with these issues. So we definitely want to make sure that we're connecting people with good information. So one of the things that I've heard a lot about as I've talked to different businesses and some of their challenges is that some of them do have insurance, for example, that is supposed to be able to help when situations arise outside of their control. Can you speak more about what people should be thinking about in terms of the insurance components and what kind of coverage they may want to see if they have?
Yeah, sure. So the type of insurance coverage that's that might be relevant in the COVID-19 crisis is called business interruption insurance. Most likely it won't cover COVID-19, but you should ask your insurance agent if you have this coverage, and if so, whether it covers COVID-19. And if you don't get a satisfactory answer from them, you can also call the California Insurance Commissioner. Call the California Insurance Commissioner at 1-800-927-4357. That's 1-800-927-4357. Or go to their website to view their FAQ about business interruption insurance.
Wonderful. And I think this is true because a lot of the insurance coverage that people do have typically pertains to physical damages or natural disasters and those kinds of things. And so we definitely want to make sure that people are looking at their insurance coverage, but as Tobias says, there may not be potentially coverage depending on what your policy states. So definitely make sure to take a look at it. And just so folks know who are tuning into the webinar, we're also going to be putting links up to some of the resources that Tobias is referencing through the chat function. So just know that you don't have to try to jot down very quickly what he is saying. We're going to be putting those resources available through the chat function as well, so you can get to them later on. And so let's get then to, I think, some of the things that are top of mind with regard to the moratorium. And so in mid-March or so, the Mayor London Breed did put forward a commercial eviction moratorium. Can you speak more about that and what kinds of businesses typically would be covered under that moratorium, as well as things that people should know about that moratorium that are important?
Sure, thanks for asking about that, Assessor Chu. So The moratorium was in effect, has been in effect since March 18th, and it's going to be in effect currently until May 17th, 2020, but it might be extended by the mayor. We don't know yet.
Right.
In terms of who it applies to all commercial tenants in San Francisco who have a San Francisco business license and who have less than $25 million in gross receipts for 2019 and who missed a payment due to the COVID-19 financial impact. Oh yes, thank you for switching this slide. And just to be clear, it does apply to you even if you're paying rent month to month, or if you stayed past the expiration of your old lease. So if you're what's called a holdover tenant. And just to go over really quickly the procedure in the commercial eviction moratorium. First I'd like to just mention that the point of the moratorium is to prohibit landlords from making any attempt to evict a commercial tenant due to missed payment under their lease that was missed due to a COVID-19 related financial impact. So, if this happens, the procedure is that the landlord is first required to give notice of the missed payment and then give the tenant a minimum of a 1 month cure period to make that payment.
Mm.
So then within the 1 month, the tenant is required to either make the payment or give the landlord documentation of COVID-19 related financial impact. So the documentation has to be in writing. It can be in the form of an email or a letter or any other written communication. And it can include anything that's objectively verifiable. It doesn't have to be financial documentation necessarily. If it's objectively verifiable that by the landlord that you've closed down because the shelter-in-place order has been in effect since March 17th,
Right.
and you're obviously not an essential business under that order, and it's the landlord's property, so they should be able to verify that you've been closed. You can say in your letter, we've been closed since March 17th, and therefore have been unable to get any revenue since that, or do business and get any customers since that date. If you haven't had to close down, then you might need to provide something more than that that's objectively verifiable, like some sort of high-level documentation from your financial records showing like a percentage decrease compared to an immediately previous month, like February or January. But you don't have to provide third-party verification or extremely detailed documentation. The documentation requirement is just meant to facilitate the tenant and the landlord talking together to work out a payment plan for the missed payment under the lease. So then once the tenant provides this documentation to the landlord, it automatically extends the time to make the missed payment for another 30 days and for the tenant and the landlord to work out a payment plan within that time. And the tenant can provide similar documentation in each 30-day period after that to get additional 30-day extensions for up to 6 months while the commercial eviction moratorium is in effect.
I think that's really important news and information because I think a lot of people have questions, or we've seen a few questions about what is objectively verifiable. And so I think just having some of those examples that you've shared helps orient people to what it is that they need to do. Is there anything that you want to say about, because I know that this is not about, it's not rent forgiveness per se. This is more about a deferral, right? So can you speak about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks for mentioning that. This moratorium is not meant to issue any kind of rent forgiveness or like to cancel the rent that's owed under an existing lease. So it's just meant to as a mechanism to allow the tenant to delay payment and for the tenants and landlords to work out a payment plan under their existing lease arrangement for the missed payment. So that, tenants have to make the missed payment eventually. The moratorium doesn't prevent them from having to do that.
Yeah, and I think that leads to a really good segue to the next question, which is, for a lot of people, if they had the ability and wherewithal, they'd pay the rent, right? But
Right.
because
Exactly.
they can't, the deferral is one thing that helps, but at some point in time, that rent payment is due, right?
Right.
Whether it's a month from now or however long the period goes, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think a lot of people have in their mind, okay, the deferral helps for now, but I just don't have any income to be able to eventually even make a payment later on when it finally does come due. And so there has been a lot of conversation around, is it possible to potentially negotiate or talk with your landlord about what options there might be? So options to potentially pay what is owed over time, or different strategies or things that maybe the landlord and the tenant can come to agreement on. And I think, I think here's the thing is that we have a lot of small businesses that because they are so impacted by COVID-19, they can't open, they're not open, or they're opening for very limited amounts of time. And then there are some property owners who can help to absorb some of that if they've owned the property for a long time, if they no longer have a mortgage, for example. But there are also small property owners who maybe have purchased the properties recently where they're also dependent on that income to kind of make things work too. And so I think this really is a question of kind of what is the capacity and ability of some of these property owners to be able to help during this time. And I think that's all going to be a different situation depending on who it is. So I wonder if you have some tips or thoughts for both property owners as well as commercial tenants about what are the things that people could consider to help alleviate, I guess, this financial strain on people. Because if I don't have income for 2 months, I still don't have two incomes for 2 months, two months later, right? And so,
Right.
Can you share a little bit about some of those tips of ideas that people, landlords and small businesses can maybe talk through and see if they can come to an agreement on?
Sure. I'd be happy to do that. Annie, would you mind pulling up the slide about rent relief for tenants and landlords? And just while that's being pulled up, I just wanted to mention also before we get into this topic that the California Judicial Council issued an emergency rule on April 6th, preventing landlords from going ahead with eviction lawsuits filed after that date once they filed them. So this also protects tenants against eviction statewide. But to answer your question, Assessor Chu, the main thing to do for landlords and tenants, who need to come up with what to do about missed rent payments right now is to try to agree on a payment plan, or agree on terms of a plan that aren't necessarily the same as the terms of the lease, but with which both parties can live with. So that could look like, for example, postponing the tenant's payment of rent until a future mutually agreed upon date, or where the landlord, if it's possible, like you said, some landlords can do this. The landlord could agree to absorb some or all of the difference between the full rent owed under the lease and the decreased rent for a certain number of months. Also, I would encourage landlords and tenants to get creative. So, if both parties can live with some other definition of what constitutes rent for a certain number of months, for example, they could agree that the tenant could give like a percentage of net revenue to the landlord in lieu of the rent under the lease for a certain number of months. That's a possibility. And also, tenants and landlords can agree to extend the lease term to make up for missed rent payments. If the landlord is okay with extending the lease term, then that could give the tenant extra time to make up for the rent that was missed during the COVID-19 crisis. The most important point remember when landlords and tenants are working out some sort of agreement to modify the lease to during this crisis is to put down what they agree to in some sort of written form, whether that be a letter signed by the landlord, or an email from the landlord, or an email from the tenant with the landlord responding, "I confirm that this is correct." That way both parties can hold each other accountable, and it's like any contract. You want to avoid confusion down the road as to what you agree to.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think that is really good advice, because the just having practical ideas for things that you can float to your, I think, landlord and vice versa, I think is a good thing. And actually that answers a question that Ron Benitez has. His question was, what negotiated advice do you have to provide to negotiate rent? And he was pointing out the same thing, that if they cannot pay certain months because of no income generated, is there any way to ask for canceled or to cancel or to have leases extended for the number of months you couldn't pay? And so I think your comments about some of those ideas, Tobias, is really right on the mark in terms of things that people might be able to kind of reach out to their landlords to do.
Thank you, Assessor Chu.
There is a section that, one of the slides that you had previously shared with us, and there was a question from one of the individuals about whether some of these slides will be made available, and we certainly can make them available to folks.
Yes.
But I do want to say that there are some practical tips about, even how it is that you might even begin to write to your landlord and start to communicate, right? And so
Exactly.
maybe you can kind of verbally talk through some of those?
Yeah, of course, sure, I'd be happy to. I just wanted to mention as a resource for folks, our partner organization, Mission Economic Development Agency, has released a template letter that commercial tenants can use to approach their landlords. So that the link to that template letter will be made available in the chat section. But some possible items to mention in the letter are just basically explaining your situation to your landlord as much as possible, in as much detail as you feel comfortable including, and tell them about what your business's specific experience has been under the COVID-19 crisis, how it's affected you, your revenue, your customers, etc. And tell them also about your efforts that you're making to continue your business for the long term, even though you might be shut down now. Of course it's going to look different for every business.
Right.
Not everyone's going to be able to reopen at the same time, or all the timelines are going to be different. But tell them about your specific plans that you have right now to reopen and to continue your business. And another important point to get across is that you're both in this together, and that you want to keep the lines of communication open.
Right. And I think that's a really important point, because I think it's costly to landlords also to lose a tenant, right? And then to try to have to find someone to come back later on. It's sometimes even better just to be able to keep an existing good tenant you've been working with. And so I think all of our hope is that everybody knows that this is really an unprecedented situation.
Exactly.
It's not anything that any of us would have imagined, and some of it has been because we do have a shelter-in-place order. There really are significant restrictions to operating in a way that I think everybody understands. Everybody knows that we're dealing with this right now, and so the hope is that both the small business and the property owners will be able to say, okay, we're in it together, like you said, and let's try to figure out a way forward and preserve these positive relationships that we have.
Exactly.
So maybe we can go turn now to some of the questions that we've received, Tobias, and I'll read some of them to you.
Sure.
And then I think some of them, I think you've answered through the presentations already, but it's helpful to go through.
Of course.
We had a question about the extensive documents. And so I just want to make sure that if there's anything that we're missing or that we didn't provide earlier, you can add to it. The question is, commercial tenants are being asked to provide extensive documentation to prove COVID-19 impact. We're concerned that these requirements are not only inappropriate, but could be used against commercial tenants who don't have rent caps and are vulnerable now and when lease negotiations come up. What is the city doing to help small businesses deal with both these long and short-term concerns? Can you tell us a little bit more, Tobias, from your point about the documentation. Again, let's reiterate some of the objectively verifiable components.
Mhm. Right. So under the eviction moratorium that the mayor issued and under the Office of Economic and Workforce Development guidelines, the documentation of COVID-19 related financial impact just has to be in written form and objectively verifiable. And the explanation has to be objectively verifiable. So, you know, if the tenant says in a letter or in an email to the landlord, you know, I've been closed down since March 17th due to the shelter in place order because I'm not an essential business, then I think that should be objectively verifiable for the landlord, because, you know, they should be able to verify that the business was closed. It's their property. And, you know, because the business is closed, you know, unless they somehow have like some online shop, like it's probably not possible for them to get any revenue, or even if they did, you know, it would mean a decrease in revenue because their in-person customers wouldn't be coming through the door anymore. I don't think that, again, I think that the OEWD guidelines are pretty clear that, you know, a third party documentation by a third party like a CPA is definitely not required.
Right.
And my understanding is that, you know, what counts as objectively verifiable was left purposely vague and to allow tenants and landlords maximum flexibility in reaching an agreement on a payment plan. So it's not an opportunity for landlords to demand as much documentation as possible from tenants. The purpose is so that tenants and landlords can work something out, or that, you know, the tenant can just provide a simple explanation to the landlord as to why they missed the rent payment and that they've been impacted by COVID-19 financially.
And to the person who asked that question, if you visit the OEWD website as well, there is a section, a FAQ, frequently asked questions section, that actually does say that folks do not have to provide detailed financials or have it be prepared by, say, a third party like a CPA. And so,
exactly.
Yeah, so it does have some information like that can help to guide you.
Yeah.
Yeah. Here's another question. So the question is, commercial tenants have no rent control for their space. What kind of protection would one have if our lease is due in July 2020?
That's a great question. So unfortunately, I just want to mention that unfortunately for small business tenants in California, rent control is prohibited statewide by state law called the Costa-Keene-Seymour Property Investment Act of 1987. So it means that cities in California cannot enact commercial rent control measures. That said, there still are things you can do to try to get leverage in negotiations with your landlord. If you have to negotiate a lease extension with them, for example, you know, it all depends on the situation in your neighborhood where your business space is located. But you know, if the rents of other business spaces in your neighborhood that are currently being rented out or that are being offered for rent are rents that you think that you can pay, then you can get as much information about those rents as possible and present that to your landlord and say, you know, this is what's being offered and what people are paying in our area for similar premises to mine, you know, per square foot. That's what I'd like to use as a basis of negotiations for negotiating a lease extension with you. And you can go to different real estate websites like loopnet.com to check out those the available listings in your neighborhood.
Wonderful. A few other ones that are pretty quick questions. I think this one I can help to answer. Small businesses or small independent hotels are also struggling to make ends meet. What can be done to help them survive? Are there any grants or low interest loans available? What we understand, for example, is that the federal government is also, if they haven't already, they're really considering a second round of PPP loans. And also EIDL loans as well. And so we would definitely encourage people to take a look at those options and see if these are things that your businesses would qualify for. So again, just some of the federal programs, the EIDL loan, as well as the PPP, is something that small hotel operators, because there are really some super small kind of bed and breakfast type operations that may be able to take use of those programs. There's a second question here related to that as well that said from Charles Griswold that asked if a business has already submitted a PPP application in the bank system but have not received a loan, do you need to reapply during a second round of funding for the PPP program? That one, I think I've only talked to a few banks, so I think the best advice is to go directly to the banks where you have already submitted that application and ask whether you need to do anything more, or if they're just going to be submitting it to the queue. Because we have heard that there are some banks that already have sort of a line of applications that they were ready to process, but the money ran out. And so for those banks, they may just be picking up where they left off and submitting it, but you would want to check with your independent bank to find out if that's their intention. On top of that, there are also other businesses who are looking around to see if there are other institutions that are also processing loans as well on top of sort of their existing institutions. So I would definitely suggest, Charles, that you reach out to the banks, the folks who have already processed your loan to see, or who have gotten the paperwork together to see if they need anything more from you or if they're going to be resubmitting on your behalf. Here's a question for you, Tobias, and if there are other questions that come up, we'll try to grab your questions and try to answer them if you leave your contact information. But here's a question about from an anonymous attendee who asks, I'd like to hear any commentary you can share about this experience, about how this experience, force majeure, might impact personal guarantees in a commercial lease. Thank you.
I think that depends on, so the person who's asking the question is talking about the force majeure clause of contracts, which is a clause that allows the two parties of the contract to get out of their performance obligations if there's some unexpected event that occurs. I think that you'd have to look at to see if there's a force majeure clause in the personal guarantee agreement that allows the guarantor to get out of the obligation to pay the rent if the tenant can't pay the rent. So you'd have to look at the personal guarantee agreement. But if you need to, the best thing to do if you need specific advice would be to contact an attorney to look at the contract for you and advise you about this. So I'd just like to mention some resources, if that's okay.
That'd be great.
So if you can afford to pay for an attorney, two resources to contact are Bay Area Legal Incubator. That's www.bayarealegalincubator.org. They are a group of solo attorneys that work at reduced rates for low to moderate income people, and also San Francisco Bar Association Lawyer Referral and Information Service. So www.sfbar.org/LRIS. They can also provide referrals to paid attorneys. And if you can't afford to pay an attorney right now, my organization, Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights, is currently offering 1-hour brief consultations via phone or video chat on commercial lease questions to small business tenants. And to apply, the link will be posted in the chat. It's tinyurl.com/LSE application.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think we certainly have learned a lot hearing all of your comments and some of the thoughts that you have. I think especially because some of the elements around leases, around different rules are very complicated. And so we want to thank you for taking the time to spend with us. So for everybody who has tuned in, just remember that all of the links and resources that Tobias has spoken about, we've actually put on the chat function. So I'm looking at it right now. There's a lot of web links, for example, for you to be able to get to some of the sites and some of the resources that Tobias mentioned. So definitely make sure to check that out. Again, to folks, we are going to make the video and these links and the slides available to you as well. So also know that we're going to be able to provide that for you. And then I guess Again, we just want to say thank you. There was a question on the chat function that asked, do we know when the shelter-in-place order is going to be lifted? I think that this is the question that many people are talking about. You've heard all across the state and across the nation, actually, a lot of people talking about how that might happen at some point in time. And the governor, for example, laid out some measures, health measures and other things that they're going to be looking at to figure out when is it going to be safe to reopen. And I think the issue here is that we absolutely know there is a financial cost of having shelter in place. We also know that we need to absolutely make sure that we're protecting the public health as well, and that we're doing the reopening in a smart way. And so I think a lot of people are beginning to talk through kind of what that will mean realistically. So I think for everybody out there, I want to thank Tobias again for coming on and sharing the useful information. But also for everybody, remember, please continue to shelter in place, continue to please do social distancing so that we can continue to have progress on the public health side, so that we can get back to some movement in our economy, so that we can all kind of get back to some kind of normalcy. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Tobias.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.